Many of you know Charlie. He's been around for a while. He's had experience at Data Walk and Cincinnati and Research Innovation Incorporated. He's been a little bit everywhere. So let you guys go ahead and welcome Charlie Gibberti with Private Sector Jobs for Crime Analysts. Go ahead, Charlie.
Thank you, Caleb. So before we get started, I do just want to let everyone know I did put a link to this presentation in the chat. You're more than welcome to access it and download it. I really want this to be something that's a little bit more fun, easy to listen to, easy to follow, easy to ask questions. So there's no need to write notes or anything. Everything that you're going to see on the screen today, I just give away absolutely freely. Additionally, I do want to acknowledge Chris Delaney is not here with me today, but we did the first iteration of this presentation back in 2022, and he really helped me get this off the ground. I've added something to it. We've iterated it every time we do it, but his contributions just need to be noted. And I do rely on his content still somewhat. Additionally, I want to thank CCAA just for the opportunity to have this conversation. So the first time we presented this material, it was in 2022 at the International Association of Crime Analysts Conference. And I've been presenting at their conference and others like it for a couple of years now. And I typically present on things like Power BI or Excel or Access or Esri or whatever. And usually I'll get one or two people who will kind of approach me afterwards with some questions. But after that particular presentation where we talked about private sector jobs, it was just an onslaught. And still to this day, I have people who were at that conference 2 years ago reaching out to me and asking questions. So this sort of became something that I do. And as I've gone around and talked to other groups about it, a lot of them are very welcoming, but a lot of them are not. There are a lot of analyst associations who believe that crime analysis is only something that is done inside local police departments, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. But additionally, there's this idea that the private sector is going to steal our analysts. That's like a bad thing. And the analogy that I always use is the military. You know, if I told you I was going around to the military and telling people who are enlisted ways that they can get involved in the private sector after their enlistment is done, everyone would say that's a noble thing. But for some reason, it's taboo when we talk about police departments. But there are some people who, you know, they come in, they do a period of service for 4 or 5 years. And if they want a new challenge, if they want more income, if they just want to grow in a completely different job, I think it's incumbent upon the groups that are supposed to serve those populations to have conversations like this and educate the population on what all is out there. And I think that that's a great thing to do. So thank you, CCAA, for just the opportunity to even talk about this. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to share a little bit about my story. I started off the first 30 plus years of my life in the public sector. The transition to the private sector was really difficult for me. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges. But I don't just want this to be a presentation that is for analysts looking to get out. I also want this to be something that analysts or supervisors who are, you know, they're going to stay in police departments, they're lifers, and they want to build up analysts in their unit or analysts around them. What are some key takeaways that you can learn about the industry? What are some things that you need to know when you're competing against the private sector to retain your analysts? So we'll talk a little bit about some data that I've collected along those lines. I also want to talk about myths and legends about the private sector. I'm sure that a lot of you know what I'm talking about when you talk about when you're surrounded by lifelong police employees, the things that people say about the private sector, like, yeah, you can make more money, but, and are those things true, or are they well-worn methods to try to retain people? Are they kind of legends? And so I'll tackle a little bit about that. The meat of the presentation is all about private sector opportunities. So where are the jobs? What are the job titles? What do they do? How is that similar to what you as a crime analyst do? How do your skills translate? Then we'll talk a little bit about what to know when applying. And then, of course, I'll leave time at the end of this for questions, and I hope that there are plenty. I know that our time is set for 3 o'clock. I've been told I can go over. And, of course, I'm more than happy to stay late if anybody has any follow-up questions. So a little bit about me. I came out of college. My very first real job was with the Bay County Sheriff's Office in Panama City Beach, Florida. I was a sheriff's deputy I was in law enforcement in that area altogether for just under 5 years. I left that job initially to go into academia. So I went to a PhD program at the University of Cincinnati, a PhD, which one day I might finish, but we'll see. While I was there, I decided that academia really wasn't my thing. and I was looking for a way to get out, but my certification for law enforcement had already lapsed, and I was, hundreds of miles away from where I would have been a police officer. And I kind of really fell backwards into a crime analyst role. Cincinnati PD happened to have an analyst opening. I didn't really know what a crime analyst did at the time, but the job description mentioned Excel and intelligence and these sort of nebulous things that I kind of have an interest in. So I signed up. We did really well there. When I first started, one of the units that I supported was the problem-oriented policing team. They called it Pivot, Place-Based Investigation of Violence in Inner Territory. That group won the Goldstein Problem-Oriented Policing Award. A couple of years later, me and my unit would win the IACA Innovation Award. We were doing really great analytics, but I was running into a lot of frustrations. There was, despite the fact that we were giving the department gold, there was kind of this lack of actual buy-in from the top. There was sort of a second-class citizen structure whenever you're not sworn inside a police department that I found to be really frustrating. So I left that job and I took a supervisory job at the city of Wichita, was standing up a new unit. I was there for just about 2 years, and I ran into a lot of the same problems. And I realized it was actually the exact same problems. It was just different faces. There's different names of units, but it was the same thing. And at that point, I had been talking to other analysts. I'd been going to conferences for a while. And the stuff that I was going through was the same thing that analysts around the country were going through. And even though I realized that there were sort of these systematic problems working in police departments that were really frustrating for me, when I decided that it was time for me to leave Wichita, I immediately started looking at local police departments that were hiring crime analysts. And so I started throwing out all these applications. And I had a really good friend at the time. And I told her, I'm applying for this job over in Texas, and I'm applying for this job in New York and this job in California. And she kind of stopped me and she was like, well, you had these same issues in Cincinnati. You had them in Wichita. What makes you think that going to another local police department is going to be any different? And I had never actually had to vocalize my answer to that. But whenever I kind of stammered out a response, it was basically like, well, yeah, but what else am I going to do? And she said, well, why not the private sector? And I said, I don't know, the private sector, what is even out there for me? I'd have to start all over. When my job search got to a point where I had been looking for 2 or 3 months and I hadn't really gotten any bites, I started reconsidering the private sector. But at that point, I was applying to the chain of restaurants that I worked at when I was an undergrad. And I was like, well, maybe they'll let me be an assistant manager, because I just didn't know what was out there. And so one day I went over to LinkedIn and I did what I'd normally done. I was typing in crime analyst and I was looking for city jobs. And instead of typing in crime analyst, I just typed in crime and I saw what came up. And the first job that came up was financial crime investigator for Bank of America. And I thought that was really interesting. And I read the job description and it mentioned a certification, the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists certification. And I was like, well, I've never even heard of that certification before. So I typed that into LinkedIn and I saw the jobs that came up. And they were things like fraud analysts, and they were working at places like Walmart. And I started reading these descriptions, and they were saying things like use data to find trends in crime, support investigators to increase closure rates, engage in problem solving. Things that you could have copy and pasted out of that job description and put into a crime analyst job description, and it would have fit. And all of a sudden, there was just this whole private sector crime analysis field that had opened up to me that I had never, with all my involvement in professional associations and academic programs, doing law enforcement for a long time, I had never even heard of. And so I started blasting out resumes just to everything that I possibly could. I applied to places like Amazon. I applied to places like Etsy.com. I applied to jobs at Walmart, blasting out these resumes. Ultimately, one of the big turning points in my life was in the middle of all of this constant applying. I think I went back and actually found my computer from that period, and I applied to 1,200 jobs in a 3-month period. I was a machine. And so one day I went for a jog and I was listening on Audible to a book called Hillbilly Elegy. And the story is about this young man who grew up in Appalachia in abject poverty, went on to graduate from Yale Law School, and now he's very successful. And at the end of the book, he compares and contrasts the way his family that was impoverished did things and the way that his very affluent, successful networks do things. How poor people do things versus how rich people do things. And one of the sections about finding a job. And he said, poor people blast out their resumes to as many places as they possibly can. And I'm sitting there and I immediately stop walking dead in my tracks whenever I hear him say that, because I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing. And he was like, but rich people lean on their networks. And so I don't know why the thought had never crossed my mind before, but I had a network when I sat down and I thought about it. I've been going to these conferences. I've been talking to vendors that are all in the private sector. There are all of these grant programs that I've heard about, and there are people that I know that have worked with me in the past to some capacity. So I reached out to two different people. One of them was Chris Delaney at Esri. Another one was Mark Massop, who was the chief sales officer at DataWalk at the time. And I just said, hey, I don't really know what I'm looking for here, but I'm looking for an opportunity. If you guys have anything that you think I might be a good fit for, let me know. And they both sent me over job descriptions that had engineer in the title. I think the Esri job was solution engineer, and the DataWalk was, pre-sales engineer or something like that. And both of these job descriptions had all sorts of stuff in it that were just way over my head. The DataWalk one in particular said, must know Python, must know Java, must have 5 years of experience as a Linux administrator, must be a certified Docker expert. There's like 15 bullet points of must-haves in this job description. And so I called both of them back and I said, hey guys, thanks for considering me, but I don't think this is for me. And both of them encouraged me to just apply and see what happened. So I applied, even though out of all those 15 bullet points, maybe one or two I could say I in earnest actually could do. Ultimately, I wound up getting both job offers. I wound up going with DataWalk, and sort of towards the end of that process, after they had given me an offer, Mark called me back and he said, so I want you to know, we interviewed like 10 people. You were the only one that did not have a master's in computer science, and you are our unanimous number 2 pick out of all 10. And the first guy passed, so we went with you. And I couldn't really understand that, because in my brain, the job description itself represented the job, and that was just all there was to it. And he kind of started to explain to me, he was like, no, Charlie, you gotta understand, you're the only one who talked about how you could adapt our solution to what police departments want to see, because you're the only one who's done that. You're the only one who was able to explain very technical concepts in lay terms to people who were not technical. You were the only one who was able to do that. The hard skills we think that we can teach, but you were the person that we wanted to work with the most. We said that we ranked you all on a scale of how technical you were. You came in 10th, but I was ultimately the one who wound up getting the job. So that's kind of a little bit about me and how I transitioned to the private sector. Today, I work full-time for a company called Research Innovations Incorporated. We customize data analysis solutions for the federal government. So I spend a lot of my time working with the Department of Justice, the money laundering and asset recovery section. We have a really cool analytical tool that lets you take PDF bank statements and scan it in, and it outputs link charts and all sorts of cool stuff. I also stay engaged with the crime analyst community through the Crime Analyst in Residence program. So CAR is a totally free, grant-driven program. If you are the only analyst at your department, or if your department has no analyst, you can apply. The application takes about 30 seconds. You can do that at crimeanalystinresidence.com. If selected, they embed one of their full-time analysts with you for a period of 6 months. They bring in different SMEs to implement automated analytics and automation and all sorts of cool stuff. So if you're interested, please apply. That's a little bit about where I'm at. So let's talk about you. So we first made this presentation in 2022. It was the height of the Great Resignation. It was the most active job market in American history in the wake of COVID. People are all of a sudden able to work remote for the first time. So now that job that's out in California that used to require you to be there now doesn't require you anymore. So the number of jobs you could qualify for went up exponentially. People were getting sent home. They were told that they didn't have to live in those cities anymore. A lot of people were getting unemployment, so they just weren't working at all. And the people that were finding all of these great opportunities. So at the height of all of that, I think that this is from the Pew Research Center. They started asking people, why did you want to leave your job? And the number one answer was pay was too low. I don't know if anybody who works in a police department can empathize with that, but number two was no opportunities for advancement, and number three were felt disrespected at work. And those top three really stood out to me because I think that those areas are particularly bad inside the crime analysis field. And so whenever I went to these conferences and I started having these conversations with people were coming up to me and saying, yeah, here's the situation in my department, I'm thinking about getting out. I decided that I wanted to start systematically collecting some data on this. So earlier this year, I started putting out a crime analysis industry survey to just see what the field feels about their role, whether or not they feel supported, whether or not they feel successful, and what leads analysts to either stay at a place forever or what leads them out the door. And so I let this study kind of be the guide for the questions that we asked. And so we started looking at crime analysts and these dimensions. So one of the first things that we'd ask is, do you feel like you're compensated fairly? And this was probably the biggest shock to me out of all of our results. About 2/3 of crime analysts, a little less than, either said they agree or strongly agree that they're compensated fairly. Now, a really cynical position on this might be that a lot of crime analysts just don't know what the private sector salaries are like that are available to them. But for the most part, the things that crime analysts complained about in our survey were not compensation. And this is a really key point for managers inside analyst units, or police executives who want to attract and retain crime analysts. A lot of times when we talk about retaining crime analysts, the first thing they say is, well, we can't afford to pay them anymore, so it's just going to be what it is. But in reality, compensation is hardly ever the issue when it comes to retaining crime analysts. So what is the issue? Well, that second factor in the Pew Research study was no career growth. And this is probably the biggest problem facing the crime analyst community because, of course, crime analysts by their nature are embedded inside an organization that is managed entirely by sworn officers for the most part. About 77% of crime analysts say, my job is a dead-end job. There is no position for me to promote into. I have zero growth potential here. Only about less than a quarter say that they actually have something that they can promote into at some point. Additionally, there is the bifurcation between sworn and non-sworn. This is a real problem. Almost 2/3 of analysts say that almost 60% of analysts say that they either agree or strongly agree that non-sworn are treated like second-class citizens inside a police department. We wanted to talk a little bit about schedule flexibility. And so we asked two questions. The first was, with what frequency are you allowed to work remote in your role? And so you can see there's definitely a skew towards rarely or never over there in the bar chart on the left. But then we asked a follow-up question. That was your perception of remote work. How often could you work remote and still do your job very effectively? And as you can see, there's a very significant skew in the opposite direction. Most analysts believe that they can either work from home full-time or 1 to 3 days per week and still do their job very well. Very few analysts believe that they are never able to work from home and still be effective. And so this is one of those tensions between analysts and those who manage analysts that is probably causing a lot of people to scoot out the door, this perception that I could have a lot more flexibility than I'm actually allowed. And this is one thing that does not cost police departments anything to enact, to let your analysts go home and work from home a few days a week. When we started going through all of this quantitative data, we've also pulled a few analysts aside and started collecting some interviews. And there's among the analysts who really want to move up, there's this really intense feeling of frustration because a lot of them will say things like, no, they're looking at creating a position and it's got to go to city council. And we've been talking about it for a couple of years. But there's also this almost animosity from the sworn side when it comes to creating new positions and new opportunities for non-sworn. And one of the analysts that we talked to at a small department in Georgia told us this story. That she said, when I talked to my immediate supervisor about the possibility of creating a senior analyst role for me, he replied by saying, you don't need to be a supervisor. I'm your supervisor. And you can just understand that when she was quoting him, her voice dropped. You could see the frustration on her face. This analyst has actually just recently left her department and now has a really great job working for Microsoft. So she transitioned out of the public sector into the private sector because of this imaginary ceiling that is over most analysts. So we started collecting this data. We started getting this idea that a lot of analysts inside police departments are kind of frustrated. But I also started looking at other accounts of data analysts inside government more generally. So oftentimes when we talk about crime analysts, we talk about things like using data to make the police department more effective. Well, there are city staff programs also who are using data to make every other department in the city more effective as well. And one of the most well-known ones is the Denver Peak Academy. And the founders of the Denver Peak Academy wrote this fantastic book called Peak Performance, talking about standing up that analytical unit. And so if you go to their website now, they have all this really flowery language about all the great things they've done and the money they've saved the department and all of these great projects. But if you go back and read this book, the entire first 2 chapters are just about the challenges that they faced in getting established, introducing analytics to a city that's never had it before, and how hostile of a position that is. In this quote, he says, a lot of employees didn't trust us and didn't want our help. It's important for you to understand how unwanted the Peak program really was. We were met with hostility at every turn. Most of my original team members left in the first year. He goes on to explain some managers see us as a threat. If we're doing our job right, we're going to bring change that you may think is unnecessary, change that you may believe is a euphemism for discarding a process you value. For them, change is deeply personal, so they lash out. If you are a department who is putting analytics in place for the first time, you're hiring a crime analyst for the first time, or maybe you haven't had one in a while, but you're bringing another one in, this is the position that you're putting that crime analyst in. And we know that most police departments tend to skew a little bit older. They're very male. We know that most crime analysts tend to skew a little bit younger. They tend to be female more often than not. So you wrap up all those challenges with the context of putting somebody who's supposed to bring change to a department that is going to resist change. And this can become a very unappealing job for most people very quickly. I do want to wrap this section up, though, on a really positive note. So for those of you who are saying, okay, I'm a lifer in the criminal justice program and the criminal justice system, and I want to know how can I retain my employees from going to the private sector, we asked analysts to rank these 7 things in terms of how much it would impact their job satisfaction. So more flexible scheduling, more ability to work from home, more promotion potential, more training opportunities, improved understanding of how to use crime analysis from the executive level, better childcare benefits, and better technology. Does anybody want to take a wild guess at what most of the analysts said was our unanimous number 1 thing that they wanted to increase their job satisfaction? And it's not a super interactive format. But far and away, the number 1 thing that they wanted was improved understanding of crime analysis from the executive level. Beyond that, number 2 and 3 were improved, more training opportunities and better technology. That improved understanding of crime analysis at the executive level is something that, 1, most police departments should be striving for anyway, and 2, does not require an additional dime of payroll. And in fact, I know that there's a fixed training budget, but very few crime analysts talk about needing more money to be more content. They all talk about management that is a little bit more open-minded and wants to use them effectively. It's a very idealistic group of people who just want to see analysis make a bigger impact in their community. All right. So let's just say that you are somebody like me. You're in your police department. You realize it's not working out, and you're considering the private sector. What are the pros and cons? Well, probably the biggest one is higher pay, and it's almost hard to quantify that because in the private sector, you will often get a compensation package that is salary and also profit sharing and also stock. So when you look at like data private sector jobs, they'll often compare salaries to public sector jobs. And it's like, well, the private sector pays 10% more or whatever. But it's really difficult to actually quantify how much the profit sharing, how much the stock packages might be worth. So the disparity is actually a lot bigger than what most people think. Most private sector jobs, every single one that I have either applied to or been a party to, offers some degree of schedule flexibility or work from home now. Even the companies that are requiring everybody to return to the office, the vast majority of them are allowing you to come back to the office 1 or 2 days a week. So a lot of times in discussions about private sector jobs, a lot of police officers especially will bring up a fear of travel. And no doubt there are sectors in the private sector where travel is something that's very common. I know Amanda Bruner, the president of CCAA, has a job where she travels pretty much all the time to different police departments. If you do anything in the pre-sales sector, where you're supporting sales guys, yeah, you're going to be traveling to customers. You're going to be going to conferences and stuff like that. But in reality, if you're not setting out to find a job like that, most private sector positions do not require a whole bunch of travel. It's out there if that's something that's really important to you. We'll talk about what job titles to kind of look at. But if that's not something that you really want, then it's not something that should dissuade you from looking at the private sector. New challenges. This, for me, was probably the biggest thing that drew me to the private sector because I had been at one police department. I was at Cincinnati, and we were doing comp stat. We were doing problem-solving projects, and we were doing targeted enforcement, and we were doing risk scores of offenders, and we were doing directed patrols and all of this stuff. And then I went to Wichita, and it was largely the same thing. If I had gone to another police department, it might have looked a little bit different. You might do, I don't know, stratified policing instead of problem-oriented policing or intelligence-led policing, or you might not do shoot reviews. You might do fatal traffic reviews. I don't know. But it just didn't appeal to me as something that I thought would be new and challenging that would allow me to grow as a person. And then the issue of politics, I'm going to come back to this because politics can be pretty bad in the private sector and the public sector as well. And then we've got this other column. We initially called this cons, but the more we thought about it, the more we realized that there are a lot of things, there are a lot of phrases, there's a lot of terminology that float around police departments almost as a way to prevent people from considering the private sector. And they're really kind of the boogeyman in the closet. There's something that you're afraid of, but when you look at the reality, it's like, is that really something to be afraid of? The number one is job security. So a lot of the public sector folks I talk to will say, yeah, I know I can make double my money in the private sector, but I've just got all this job security working for the city. And yeah, that is true. You are less likely to get laid off from the city of whatever as a crime analyst than you are working for Datawalk or Esri or whatever. But, in the investment world, they talk about two different kinds of risks. There's the risk if you make an investment and it crashes. There's also the risk if you don't make an investment and it goes up. And the analogy there is, yeah, you're more secure. You're not going to experience a layoff, but you're way more likely to go 25 years with being vastly underpaid if you stay in that super secure job. So if you can go somewhere and make 50% more, but every 3 or 4 years you experience 2 or 3 months of joblessness, doesn't that put you way, way far ahead whenever it comes time to actually retire? So, and at this point, I've been in the tech world now long enough to have seen a couple of my friends get laid off. Thank God I've never been laid off, but I've seen some companies do layoffs. I have never seen anybody in the private sector get laid off and say, I need to go get a local government job so I can get me some more security now. It doesn't typically work like that. When you get into this world, you start to work with customers. You start to work with other companies. You go to these conferences. Your network grows exponentially. And so just like I was saying in the beginning, lean on your network to get a job. The private sector opens up your network to grow exponentially. So if I got laid off tomorrow, my first 3 calls would be to people who have been customers or collaborators on projects with me in the past. I also hear all the time that the benefits are better in the public sector. I have no data to back this up, but I 100% believe that this is baby boomer nonsense. This is something that was probably true in the 70s and 80s, but every single time I have seen an analyst get a private sector job offer, it's always been like a really impressive step up in terms of pay. But then you start to look at how much you save on your healthcare and how much better your retirement package is and how much better your vacation package is. And people's retinas really begin to pop. So I don't know that I've ever seen anybody get a private sector job offer and say, oh, the benefits aren't as good. That's just not, I just don't think that's realistic anymore. There's the concern that you wind up further from the mission. And again, this is kind of like the travel thing. It depends on what sort of role you go after. I know Amanda Bruner is sitting side by side with crime analysts inside police departments every single day of her life. She is right there in the middle of the mission. And my role with RII, I'm sitting next to DOJ investigators every single day. And we're helping them do really complex money laundering investigations. So there are roles out there where you'll be stuck in a cubicle somewhere doing things that are removed from the mission. But there are a ton of roles out there where you're every bit as involved in the investigation and prevention of crime as you are inside a local police department. And in fact, a lot of roles where you are far more central to really big investigations and really big crime problems than you ever will be working inside a local police department. The nature of vacation does tend to kind of change, especially if you are working for a company that does sales. If there's a big opportunity and there's a big deadline, it doesn't matter if you're on vacation, that has to get made. So in the public sector, it is a little bit nicer. You can just be like, I'm turning off my phone and I'm not talking to anybody for a week. That kind of changes a little bit when you go into the private sector. And then politics are different. I came out of a couple of agencies where, the chief and the captains and the deputy chiefs were all involved with lawsuits, and it was all very public and it was all very political. And so I would say that in my time in the private sector has been less politics, but they're still there. You still get people up in upper management that don't like each other. You still get tension in meetings. People disagree on which way to go. It's just a little bit different. All right, so where are all of these opportunities? We've kind of loosely broken them down into 3 different categories. Corporate investigation and security, training, teaching, and consulting, and software and technology companies. All right, so in the corporate investigation and security side, one of the biggest fields with the most opportunities for crime analysts to transition is the anti-money laundering field. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is all driven by the Bank Secrecy Act. Bank Secrecy Act, I think, was originally posted in like the 40s. And it was basically a piece of legislation that said banks have to keep certain records. Well, in the 1980s, we're starting to fight the war on drugs. And we realized I can arrest a drug dealer with a bag full of coke, but that doesn't really make much of an impact because there's still $1 billion going across the border into South America back to the people who are running these big cartels. That's really what we need to get after. So in the 80s, they passed a whole bunch of amendments to the Bank Secrecy Act that said, hey, you have to do a whole bunch of due diligence to make sure that your banking institution is not being used to facilitate illegal transactions. So you have to report on suspicious activity. You have to proactively prevent money laundering and terror financing. You have to analyze transactions to determine what might be suspicious, what might indicate that those transactions are actually flowing to somewhere we don't want them to flow. You have to risk score every transaction that comes across your bank every single day. And if it is suspicious enough, you actually have to initiate an investigation, and that investigation might involve interviews and collecting evidence, writing a report, and sending it off to the federal government. In 2001, right after September 11th, they iterated the Bank Secrecy Act again. And they said, okay, now banks, not only do you have the responsibility to proactively investigate drug crimes, but you also have to proactively look for terror financing too. And then in the last couple of years, they've begun adding legislation that puts the onus on banks to investigate human trafficking and child grooming behaviors on online platforms. So all of these banks have started developing these AML analytics units. And in the private sector, when crime starts to affect a company's bottom line, you start to see a massive investment in investigating and preventing crime. So one of the ways that crime affects their bottom line is that if you don't put these things in place, if you don't have enough analysts, if they don't have good enough technology, if they're not identifying a certain number of risky transactions, if they're not investigating them thoroughly, the government is very quick to come in and pull the trigger on some billion-dollar fines. So you can see I've got an article here about Capital One getting hit over a $390 million fine. This to me is so incredibly different from what we're used to in the public sector, because in the public sector, if you have a crime analyst and they quit and now that job is vacant, there's no rush to fill it. It's not like, oh, we have to keep an analyst on staff. It's like, all right, well, we have to put the request into human resources and they have to go find the job description and they have to post it for 30 days. And we have to make sure X number of people apply. And then and the whole hiring process can take 6-8 months while you just don't have an analyst. If your analysts don't have computers, if they don't have software, if they don't have technology, if what they're doing is not in line with best practices, there's nobody to come in and say, hey, you have to do this. In the AML world, there is. FinCEN, the Department of Justice, will come into these banks and say, no, you're not taking analytics seriously. Here's a $1 billion fine. There's a really great documentary on Netflix. There's a series called Dirty Money. One of the episodes of Dirty Money is called Cartel Bank. And it's all about Wells Fargo failing to adhere to the Bank Secrecy Act. And part of the way that they failed to adhere to it was not having enough analysts, not giving them the right technology, things like that. If this is a world you want to get involved in, some titles: anti-money laundering investigator, financial crime investigator, AML is the acronym you'll see quite a bit. Blockchain intelligence has become a really big thing as well. So who are these employers? Obviously any bank, but it's not just banks that are subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. Anybody that takes one currency and changes it from one form to another is required to comply with the BSA. So Western Union and money services bureaus, if you're allowed to send a wire or if you can go get a money order from them, they have to have an AML unit. Walmart is one of the biggest AML units in the world. They have like 300 investigators. They're all with their Bentonville, Arkansas corporate office doing nothing but trying to find people who are skirting AML requirements because they go to one Walmart and they'll get, $3,000 in money orders and, $4,000 in gift cards. And then they'll go to another one and they'll get, $3,000 in money orders and $5,000 in gift cards. And it's like, okay, none of those singular transactions trigger reporting, but all of them together do. And it's really suspicious that you're going to 12 different Walmarts to try to get all of those things instead of just getting them all at once. So things like that are the stuff that they investigate. One of the oldest and most tried and true ways to launder money is through a casino. So if you go in with $1 million and you get a bunch of casino chips, and then you hang out for 2 or 3 hours, and then you go back and you say, okay, I want to now cash my chips out for cash. They're going to say, how much of this did you win? And all you have to do is say, all of it. I came in with $1,000 and I won $1 million. They're then going to give you a receipt that says you won $999,000. Well, now you can prove where $999,000 came from. It was all gambling winnings, right? It wasn't from the coke trade. It wasn't from any sort of illegal enterprise. It was just gambling winnings. So every casino has to have an AML unit. Credit cards, if you overpay a credit card, they're going to send you a check in the mail for the difference. And that looks like you legitimately just got money from Visa or MasterCard or American Express. So again, you got a $100 bill on your credit card. You send them $10,000. They send you back $9,900. And it looks like you've got legitimate income coming from them. In reality, that money came from something illegal. One of the most interesting areas to me are online gaming platforms. So my nieces and nephews used to play Roblox, and in Roblox, you can make new content. So you can make skins. You can make your character look like I don't know, Luke Skywalker, or you can make them look like Bart Simpson or whatever. And then you can sell those to other people. And they use a currency on Roblox called Robux. So I used to give my nieces and nephews Robux gift certificates. So I would go and I would on Xbox Live and I would give them my credit card and they'd charge me $20. And then that would convert to a certain amount of Robux that I could then give my nieces and nephews. Well, because they're transitioning one currency from one form to another, you can use that for money laundering. So Roblox has an obligation to maintain BSA compliance. So what do you actually be doing? A lot of the backbone of the AML field is transaction monitoring. So every transaction that goes through every bank has to be risk scored. That means there has to be an algorithm that says, based on who sent this and where it got sent to and the date and how much it was and what we know about this person and what we know about that person, I think the probability that this is involved in something illegal is X. And if that probability goes over a certain threshold, that triggers an investigation. And then somebody has to go in, they have to look at the details, they have to do open source investigations, they might have to do interviews, and ultimately they might have to determine, is this probably illegal or is it not? If it is, you then have to write a report and send it to FinCEN and let them know, hey, we think that something illegal is going on here. One of the very first things that a federal money laundering investigator will do is file FinCEN reports, get those reports that the banks are writing on their side, and that will be the backbone of their investigation. They may also have to respond to subpoenas. And then, of course, you also, as an AML person, you might also do extensive training, because inside really large banks, everyone from the teller up to the CEO has some role to play in preventing the bank from being used in illegal enterprises. So a lot of these AML units will have full-time trainers who just travel around the country teaching bank tellers and teaching branch managers and teaching guys who do like credit card applications and stuff how to identify something that is suspicious and how to report it if they see it. This is a very formalized field. There are multiple organizations that offer certifications. The one that I have found to be probably the most legitimate is the ACAM Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialist certification. But you can actually even get a master's degree in anti-money laundering. So this is from the University of South Florida, who's offering an MBA with a concentration in compliance risk and anti-money laundering. And so this is for probably people who are more so in the legal field, but ultimately want to be a chief compliance officer for one of these banks. If that's a degree, if that's a career track that you're interested in, you might want to do the certification, but you might also want to take that a step further and actually go do some formal degree work in this. Anti-fraud is exactly the opposite of well-structured. Anti-fraud is the Wild West of crime. Fraud is my absolute favorite field to talk about, because there are so many ways to commit fraud, and fraudsters are so brilliant. I used to do a lot of murder. That used to really get me out of bed in the morning. But like after you've seen so many people get shot and die, it's kind of getting routine, right? But man, they're just always finding new ways to commit fraud. Fraud can take many forms: credit card fraud, organized retail fraud, online retail fraud. Perhaps the most bizarre fraud case I've ever been a party to was horse semen fraud. And so if you want to breed your horse with like a champion horse, but they're on opposite sides of the world, you can have them extract a semen sample, and then there are services you can pay that will transport it from that horse to your horse, and then you can impregnate your horse. Well, if I pay you $1 million to do that transport, I can double my money really quickly by going to somebody else, a third party, and just saying, hey, you want this champion horse semen? And they'll say, yeah, I'll give you $1 million for it. Cool. Then you just do a little switcheroo, give some regular horse semen to your paying customer, give the actual stuff to your criminal fence, and now you've doubled your money. There's actually a whole bunch of different ways to commit horse semen fraud. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, Google it. There's all sorts of crime scandals breaking out, especially in the UK right now. But one of the things that amazed me the most about the fraud field is how vulnerable really big organizations are to it. So Amazon, up until 2019, really had no proactive or reactive way to fight fraud. How easy was it to commit fraud? So these four brothers ran up $20 million worth of fraud from Amazon And the way they did it, they were a vendor. So Amazon would say, hey, we need Windex. And they'd order a case of Windex from them. So these guys just sent them $19 million worth of toothbrushes that they didn't order and then sent them an invoice. And then Amazon paid it. Just that easy. And you would think, man, a well-formatted spreadsheet might have been able to prevent that. But when you're dealing with companies the size of Amazon and data at the volume of Amazon, it's not quite that simple. But again, anytime crime affects the company's bottom line, all of a sudden you're going to start to see investment in crime analysis. And a lot of really big employers like TikTok, every single bank, Lyft, these are all actual job postings from LinkedIn that I snipped off a couple weeks ago. Fraud is a really fun field to go into. It is probably the most broad in terms of what the roles are. So there are some roles where you are very much a detective, especially if you're doing internal fraud. So if you're working for a really big company and you're doing the types of fraud that are like, right, somebody who is an employee for us is receiving kickbacks. Well, that's going to require very formal interviews that look very much like law enforcement interviews. Most fraud today is done online, and that is a big data proposition. So you're going to have to start auditing records, looking at sales trends. One of the coolest anti-fraud units that I've ever had the pleasure of working with was at Etsy. And so on Etsy, you sell stuff that you make yourself, right? So they were having a problem with people opening up an Etsy store, and then they would say, okay, we make custom handmade tables, something really expensive and something that takes a long time to make. And then people would say, wow, that table's really amazing. I'll buy one. And then they'll say, okay, well, it's $10,000 and you're going to wait 3 months. And I say, okay. And then for 3 months, they just do nothing but take $10,000 orders for these tables. And then right at about the 3-month mark, when the first customers are looking for their tables, all of a sudden they just vanish and they've got everybody's money. It's like, okay, well, how do we identify proactively the people who are coming onto the platform who are probably going to be engaged in something like that? What makes one seller more risky than another? All of that involves studying data. It also involves a lot of OSINT investigation. You might have to collaborate with prosecutors. This field and the AML field, like law enforcement's actual ability to investigate this is about zero, because so much of this occurs on your platform. The question of like, well, whose jurisdiction is it even comes up. But then, you've got to go through 1 billion transaction records. As a local law enforcement agency is not going to be able to do that. So these companies have to have people who can basically package all of this up and then hand it over to a prosecutor and say, here's all of the evidence that we've got. Will you please prosecute this person? There is a organization, if this is something that you're interested in, one of the most recognized credentials that you can get is the Certified Fraud Examiner credential. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners puts on a phenomenal conference every year. They had like the Fire Festival guys on a panel one year, and they had the guy that predicted the housing market collapse one year. So if you get a chance to get involved with them, they're a really great organization. Corporate security. So any company that has very highly visible executives, or any company who has financial interests all over the world, or that puts on special events, is going to have almost like a real-time crime center or a fusion center that does nothing but look out for the interests of the company. So Bank of America, for instance, has a global monitoring station where they look at things like natural disasters and riots that might affect an entire region of the world's ability to do business. And if they see something like that coming, then they have to take certain steps to minimize their loss. The NFL, they host the Super Bowl every year. They host all these big events every Sunday. There is a whole intelligence function to the NFL where they do nothing but they look for unruly fans who might be an issue. They look for terror threats. They look for natural disaster threats that might be an issue. One of the coolest job postings that I've ever heard of was for Carnival Cruise Lines. And so that's a really cool job because they do nothing but try to identify people who might be coming on board a ship who might be a problem. And so people will say, we'll sign up for a cruise, and they'll give you your name and your phone number and your credit card information. And then they hand that off to an intelligence unit who does nothing but look for people like, okay, are these people on sexual predator lists? Is that something we need to be aware of? Are one of these people in and out of prison all of the time? Is one of them recently out of prison? Is one of them on a terror watch list? Because if you put somebody who's really dangerous on a boat with 1,000 other people and then send them out to the middle of the ocean, you're potentially liable for what happens. So the big corporate security employers: Microsoft, Major League Baseball, NFL, Bank of America, Amazon. Trust and safety. This is actually probably growing into the biggest career field. I don't think it's there yet for analysts, but if you think about the number of services that you get from apps and various online platforms, anything that facilitates an interaction with you and another person, that company has some liability for those interactions. So think about care.com. If you go onto care.com and you get a babysitter for your children, and then that babysitter turns out to be a pedophile, care.com is liable for that. Or if an incident happens and the babysitter gets injured, care.com has certain reporting requirements. YouTube has to make sure that their platform isn't used to screen child exploitation material. Roblox has to make sure that pedophiles aren't getting on their platform and grooming children virtually. All of these people have to analyze big swaths of data and identify risk and identify bad actors and take them off the platform. One of the biggest areas where there are jobs for crime analysts are on dating apps. So if you think about Hinge, Bumble, Tinder, all of those different things, there's a huge analytic function that goes into making sure that the people that you're matching with and then going up and meeting with, oftentimes at night, oftentimes in somewhat shady places, that they aren't actually dangerous. One of the really big leaders in this space is Jeff Dunn. If this is something that you're interested in learning more about, I highly recommend you to follow him on LinkedIn. He does what he calls Trust and Safety Tuesday, which is where he posts a whole bunch of trust and safety content. Sometimes that includes job postings. Additionally, Kyra Watkin at KyraWatkin.com. If you go to her resources page, she has a whole bunch of job boards that list out nothing but trust and safety and similar jobs in the tech space. And they actually even host a trust and safety hackathon. So if you're still not really sure what exactly this job is and what analytics looks like inside this space, I think they do one every quarter, every 2 or 3 months. So you can actually sign up to go to the Trust and Safety Hackathon. It's tshackathon.com. And you can check out whatever challenges there. They have speakers that come out and talk about their various roles in these different companies. And it's a great opportunity to learn more about it. Software and technology companies. So where to look for these jobs? Go to a conference and walk through the vendor hall. So there's investigative analysis software. I always tell analysts, if there's something that you really enjoy working with, then that might be a clue about the types of jobs you should be applying for. If you really enjoy doing link analysis, then I2, Node Excel, Aura, all of those Blue Light, all of those places have jobs for analysts to come in and do a variety of different things. It's not just sales, but it's help us iterate the product, help us train customers, help us make sure that they're successful. If you're really into cell phone analysis, there's Cellhawk, there's Cellebrite. If you really want to do social media, there's Media Sonar and Scope Now and a whole bunch of other vendors in that space. RMS and CAD vendors. I've noticed that recently a lot of RMS vendors are getting interested in making their out-of-the-box analytics not suck. And so there have been a whole lot of different job postings that I've seen recently from like Southern Software and Central Square and a couple of others who want people who know how to do dashboards and things of that nature. If you are an Esri fanatic, Esri hires people constantly. And again, this is one of those spaces where they might put a job out that says something like solution engineer. And you're like, well, I'm not an engineer, I don't know. But if you're really engrossed in their software and you have made products with it before and you can talk about that, Those are the sorts of jobs that you should be applying for, because that's the sort of stuff that they want to hear about, more so than just, well, you have a software engineering degree. That doesn't matter nearly as much. What sort of jobs are available for you? So there is sales, and a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to do sales. The advice I give everyone is that whether you want to or not, we're all in the business of sales to some degree. Whenever we talk about generating buy-in, that's just a fancy word for sales. It's also your highest earning potential. So it is not unheard of for salespeople to make $400,000 or $500,000 a year with no degree, no formal education. They're just really good at sales. If you can build relationships with people, if you can prove to people that you're trustworthy, if you know how to treat customers right, if you can communicate effectively, sales might be something you need to look at. But even if you say, okay, well, I don't want to be the salesperson, a lot of times organizations that have a very big sales wing will have what they call pre-sales support. And these are roles, this is what I did for DataWalk. This is like, okay, you're not the salesperson, but you know the software really well. So when a customer comes to you and says, I have this problem that I'm trying to solve, it's your job to show them how this particular software solves that particular problem. And so a lot of the times it's doing demonstrations, it's customizing solutions for them. It might be training their end users. It's helping salespeople write responses. So a lot of times they'll get a request for proposal, and the salesperson will just be like, hey, does our software do X, Y, Z? And you have to be the person who's kind of like, well, sort of it does, but I would say it like this, Product development. This is what Chris Delaney does for Esri. So you get partnered with an engineer and they say, okay, I need a product that kind of looks like this. And Chris will tell you that he himself is not an engineer, but he's also responsible for the Esri crime analysis plugin, or he's part of the team. He led that initiative. Professional services. This is probably the easiest transition for most crime analysts. So if you want to, you can hire analysts, but you can also just hire Esri to come in with their professional services department and set up a bunch of dashboards for you. And you can do the same thing with most common crime analysis software. Most of them will have some sort of professional services who will host training classes or actually come in and sort of do the work for you and stand you up on your own. And then, of course, you can do marketing. If you're the type of person that loves making videos, if you're on TikTok all the time, if you're on LinkedIn, if you like making AI art and things of that nature and doing presentations, maybe marketing. Maybe combine your passion for doing all of that stuff with your passion for crime analysis. Some job titles in the sales world. Account manager is kind of the common code for sales. If you see sales engineer or pre-sales engineer or pre-sales solution engineer, that is the technical support for salespeople. That's the kind of role that I was talking about earlier that I did with DataWalk. Product owners and product engineers, those are what Chris does for Esri. These are the people who work with the engineering team to develop the software in such a way that it satisfies what customers want out of it. So you might help iterate new features, or you might help bring that product into a completely new space. In professional services, you might see job titles that mention consultant or advisor, or system engineer, data integrator. In any of the Accurate, or for instance, has sort of like a fixed ontology. They say, hey, you've got your RMS system here, but we can pull that data out and put it into this view, and then everybody can see it, and we can leverage it against other data and all this stuff. Any service that does something like that is going to have people who are really strong with relational databases and really strong with SQL, because they've got a whole bunch of tables where that data needs to go, and they need somebody who can take that data from where it currently is inside a police RMS and put it there effectively. So that's what a data integrator does. And then in marketing, you'll start to see job titles like specialist, subject matter expert, events coordinator, and my favorite is evangelist. Palantir hires a bunch of evangelists, but other people have started taking the term. Then there is training, teaching, and consulting. So a lot of people want to get into university criminal justice programs. I have found that this is really difficult to do if you don't have a PhD. even for adjunct jobs. But if it's something that you want to do, look for job titles that say adjunct or assistant professor of practice or of a practice. Those are typically oriented towards practitioners who don't have a PhD, but they have a wealth of work experience in a particular field. You should also check the BJA grants page. So the Bureau of Justice Assistance puts out grants to provide training and technical assistance to police departments all the time. And they'll usually take the form of like, we have a program that is supposed to help police departments expand analytics. And there's a companion grant that will pay somebody, even somebody in the private sector or even just an individual, $1 million over 3 years to provide training technical assistance to the people who are entered into this grant program. There's nothing that prevents you from going and competing for those things. And typically, if a grant is like $1 million or less, some of the really big players in those organizations in that space won't even go after those. But Amanda works for a company, the Center for Naval Analysis, that does nothing but bids on these grants and then hires people on a contract basis to go and provide training and technical assistance. Professional associations, nonprofits. There are software companies or companies specializing in software training. Blue Light would be a great example of that. They don't make the I2 product, but they are the I2 experts. And then, of course, you can work directly for municipalities as well, just under your own LLC. What sort of stuff can you do? Curriculum development, subject matter expertise, contract analysis services. Go ahead and move over to, we're running out of time here. Let's go ahead and move over to the private sector hiring process and how it's a little bit different from the public sector. So one of the big pitfalls that analysts will do when they're trying to get to the public sector or private sector is they will blast out the same resume to every job. So you submit a resume, somebody in HR is going to review it. They are going to serve as the first line filter to a hiring supervisor. And if the hiring supervisor likes your resume, they'll notify the HR specialist and they'll say, hey, set up an interview. The problem with that is HR people often don't have a clue what these requirements mean. So if you read a job description and they put keywords in there like Power BI, Cognos, Crystal Reports, Python, if you list out a whole bunch of analytical experience, but you're not hitting those specific keywords, this HR employee might say, you know what, their experience is not relevant, filter it out. In the public sector, this is sometimes a little bit different. In the public sector, there's almost like this fear of filtering people out. So there's like a really rigid, do you have a 4-year degree? Do you have 2 years of experience working? If yes, we pass it on. And somebody who's a little bit more familiar with the subject matter makes the call. In the private sector, those requirements from job descriptions are a lot more important. So resume pitfalls. Number one, does not match the job description requirement, and the hiring supervisor doesn't understand how your skills translate. So if the classic example is, if the job description says, we need somebody who understands Power BI, and your resume says extensive experience building dashboards, but it doesn't say Power BI, that connection may not get made by whoever's actually checking out your resume. No evidence of your skills. One of the easiest ways to evidence skills, Cassie and I were talking about this earlier. If they say, I really want somebody with skills in Cognos, well, you can hop on to Udemy and go get a Cognos certificate after like a day or two of going through a class. So list a certification out. But what's even better than that, if you can talk about your accomplishments in that particular skill set. So let's just say they say, we want somebody with Tableau experience. If you created a public-facing Tableau dashboard that is accessible on your city's website, you need to talk about, I stood up a public-facing Tableau dashboard. Talk about the things that you've actually accomplished in the workplace of your skills. But if you don't have anything to talk about there, go get yourself a certificate or a Udemy class or something like that and list that. You're a stranger with no connection to the company. I'll dive into that a little bit later or on the next slide. But then lack of emphasis on your soft skills. I have found over and over and over again that it's not the most technical or the most skilled person who necessarily gets the job. It's the person that people want to work with the most. And especially when you start getting into the tech world that is dominated by engineers, I don't think I'm going to piss off too many people when I say that engineers do not exactly have a lot of soft skills. They're not great communicators. They really don't communicate with lay audiences very well. They don't tend to be super organized. So if you're going into that particular arena and you know that you're going to be lower, like me, lower on the scale in terms of technical ability than the people you're surrounded with, emphasize your soft skills. Talk about how you can keep a project organized. Talk about building consensus. Because a lot of times in private sector companies, you're all working for the same company, but you've got all these different departments that kind of have to buy into an idea. It's kind of similar to working in a police department where you've got command staff and you got patrol and you got investigators and you're trying to coordinate everybody for a problem-solving project or a crime reduction project or something like that. Consensus building is really important. So don't be afraid to emphasize those soft skills on your resume either. So we talked about being a stranger with no connections to people on the company. It is expected that if you're applying for a job, especially a very high-paying job for a company, that you're going to do some due diligence because they're definitely going to do some due diligence on you. And one of the ways that you can do that is look at the people on LinkedIn who work there and go ahead and send them a connection request. This seems kind of taboo because in the public sector, like the application process is this very rigidly protected thing. We have to make sure that nobody can say that they had an advantage over somebody else because then that's an accusation of bias. And so there's like, well, you're not allowed to talk about it. Private sector, that doesn't exist. So if I know that somebody's applying for a job at RII and they reach out to me on LinkedIn and they just say, hey, I'm applying for this job. I'm not sure about it, but what do you think about working at RII? What's your day-to-day like? Are you happy with the job? Do they give you freedom? Do you have pathways to grow professionally? Do they give you the ability to learn? Those are fantastic questions to ask that most people are going to be more than happy to have that conversation with you. And if you can get somebody who's in a very similar position to the one you're applying for, try to set up a call with them. Try to actually get on the phone, but actively listen and show enthusiasm for the mission of that particular organization. If that organization is really, their mission is to transform police departments through the use of geographic information, talk about that. Talk about how you've done the same thing and how you're really enthusiastic about that. But learn about the culture, learn about the working conditions, learn about the values, and listen critically because that may not be the job that you want to. This is just as much about you interviewing them as it is about them interviewing you. Ask which departments are looking for similar roles, especially if you are applying to somewhere very large. I applied for a job at Amazon and I was going to look in their vendor fraud department. So they have a department that is all the people who are selling things on the platform, committing fraud against their customers. Well, so I went through like 7 interviews. It was like a gajillion of them. I wound up not getting that job, but one of the guys I interviewed with called me about a month later and he said, hey, I was one of your interviewers. You were my top candidate, but it wasn't my department that was hiring. I run logistics fraud, but I've got a position open now and I really want you to apply for it. So one of the questions you can ask is, are there other departments that do something similar to this? And if so, are there similar roles? Are there similar roles that might come open in the future? But are there similar roles that might be a slightly better fit for me than the one we're even talking about now? And then note in the cover letter that you did this and what you learned. One of the lines that I put in every cover letter is how I learned of the position. And so you can say, I learned of this position from LinkedIn.com. I was referred by so-and-so who is currently employed as a solution engineer or something like that. Throw that in the cover letter. Bring it up in conversation that you talked to so-and-so and what you asked them about and what impressed you about what they had to say. If you've got work examples that are relevant, you need to find a way to incorporate them in your interview process somehow. So if you are able to post something online, provide a link. But even if you're not able to do that, come ready with examples. If you're talking about somebody who wants Power BI skill, have your Power BI dashboard up on your desktop. And if somebody says, can you tell us about your experience with Power BI? You can say, yeah, would it be okay if I shared my screen so I can walk you through a product that I made? One analyst that I work with, she had to do an in-person interview, and she printed out a whole bunch of her work products, put them in a folder, or put them in a binder because it was huge, made 4 copies of them and shipped them off, overnighted them to this organization the day before. That was super impressive. So incorporate your work examples however you can. And again, I'm going to reiterate this: rewrite your resume for each application, shape your experience to fit the requisition. So one of the jobs that I applied for way back in the day, my standard resume does not list crystal reports, but I've worked with it before and I've used it. I'm not a big fan, but one particular job, the only hard skill they mentioned was crystal reports. And so I hopped onto Udemy and I took a 2-day class on crystal reports, and I got myself a certificate and I put that on there. And I retooled all of my experiences to talk about the projects I had worked on with crystal reports. And I got that job offer. So make sure that you're tooling that for every opportunity that you're applying to. Sanitize social media. It gets looked at. So if you've got all of your I hate Joe Biden or I hate Donald Trump posts on your Facebook, or if you've got all of the back and forth arguing with you and your ex-wife or your ex-husband, all that stuff that you need to sanitize because it may not look great. But I think what's more common are signs of desperation. I see a lot of people post on LinkedIn all the time, these like long, sad posts about how they've been looking for a job for 6 months and recruiters don't call them back and the job market's just so terrible and they're struggling with depression. LinkedIn is not the place to air that out, man. If you look desperate, if you smell desperate, that is an immediate turnoff to employers. So keep your posts there professional, keep them all positive, and make sure that none of your personal social media, if it's open to the public, has stuff that people are going to look at and be like, wow, this guy's just walking, talking drama. Demonstrate enthusiasm for the employer's mission. Highlight your soft skills. We've kind of already talked about that. And keep compensation and benefit questions. I wouldn't say keep them to HR only, because I have been in a lot of positions where like the hiring manager will ask you, how much are you looking to make? And I wouldn't tell them, oh, I'm only going to have that conversation with HR. But just make sure that it's the appropriate time and the appropriate person to talk about that with. I have done interviews with people where we've said, so tell us a little bit about yourself. And the first thing they say is, well, I'm looking to make $250,000 a year. It's like, all right, well, you'll be doing that somewhere else, not here. Negotiation. Crime analysts who get their first private sector job are the absolute worst people in the world at negotiation. I think because when you come out of the public sector, like there is no negotiation in the public sector. I think one of the most impressive things I've ever done in my life was I got an extra $5,000 out of a public sector job once. It's like the only person that I've ever heard of who did that. But it's not rude. It's not arrogant to make a counteroffer. In fact, most of the time it is expected that you will counter with something. And a positive way to do that is to say, if somebody offers you $100,000, you say, wow, this is fantastic. I'm so excited to get to work with you. I can't wait to get started. However, since my skills and abilities are towards the top end of the spectrum, could we talk about a salary closer to 115? I've heard that 15 to 20% is kind of the ballpark for what is reasonable. But I think it just kind of depends. But keep in mind that nothing's more powerful in negotiation than leverage. So you should always try to have the conversation. But if that conversation involves another offer, then you're just in a way stronger, much more reasonable position. If somebody's offering you 125, you can come back and say something like, hey, I really am so excited to get to work with you guys. This is a great job. But I've got this other offer for 125, and it's not a job that I think is as in line with what I want to do. But man, that's a lot of money, and that's a really big deal to me and my family, and I just don't know that I can ignore that. Would you guys be willing to match it? Base your counteroffer in facts, logic, and reasonableness. I have coached some crime analysts who get offers for like 100, 110, and they come back and they're just like, well, I'm going to counteroffer 150. And it's like, You can, but I would very strongly encourage you to list out what are the facts, what's the logic in that number, because that seems like a really, really big leap from what they offered you. You can negotiate for more than just salary. If they come back and they say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that, then one thing you can say is, okay, well, instead of 2 weeks of vacation this year, what about 4? What about, working from home? What about whatever? You can negotiate for retirement benefits. You can negotiate for, if you are getting a job that involves salary, bonuses, and stock, what I have found is that companies are way more willing to give you more stock than they are more salary. And that stock that they give you might actually be worth more than the salary that you're asking for. Value your current benefits properly. One of the biggest surprises that crime analysts get when they transition to the private sector is like, well, okay, the salary is only 10, 20 grand a year more, but I'm going to save another $20,000 a year just on my healthcare benefits. So my bottom line, this job pays $40,000 a year more. Make sure that you have an accurate conception of how much your benefits are worth, and make sure that you go through the benefits package for the company that's making you an offer. HR should always include that with an offer, but if they don't, make sure that you get it and you understand those costs, because there can be a ton of money there for you. And then keep in mind, a typical offer in the software space includes salary, bonuses, and stock. There is a really nasty habit of people who have never been in this space before to just disregard the bonuses and the stock, as if it like, well, you can't count on it because the stock could crash. Well, unless you're going to a 2 or 3 person startup who for some reason has IPO'd, your stock isn't going to be worth 0. Even in 2008, when the housing market crashed, the stock market crashed by 50% and it recovered in like a year or 2. So don't respond to those and just say, well, you're offering me $100,000 in salary and $25,000 a year in stock and $25,000 a year in potential bonuses. So just give me $150 a year in salary and we'll call it good. Now, you need to get some accurate conception of how much those things are worth. As far as bonuses go, it is okay to ask an employer, hey, for employees like me who get part of their income from bonuses, over the past 3 years, what percentage of their bonus have those employees actually received? And they should be able to provide that for you. That's super duper easy. And that'll give you some idea, how variable is it? Do you go some quarters with nothing? Do you go some quarters where it's 300%? Is it typically between 75 and 100%? They should be able to give you some data that you can kind of zero down on and say, okay, well, I'm going to expect to make X whenever I actually start this. All right, so I want to thank everyone for your time. I know that I went over by almost 20 minutes, but I do want to take some time to answer any questions if there are any. I haven't been paying attention to the chat, so I'm going to let Cassie or Caleb